Porcelain doll horror story. Many years ago, when I was little, my parents hired a housekeeper named Agatha to help me with household chores. Agatha was an older woman, known in the town for her reputation as a witch. People talked about its strange rituals and its connection to the world of the supernatural. However, coming from the city, my parents didn't believe in these superstitions and decided to give it a try. At first glance, Agatha seemed like a normal woman. During the day, she diligently took care of household chores and behaved in a cordial manner. However, when night fell and we were alone in the house, or when she thought no one was watching her, her behavior became somewhat disturbing. One of the strangest things I noticed was his fascination with ancient and mysterious objects. In her room, which she always kept locked, she kept a collection of strange objects, amulets, scrolls, crystals, and other objects whose existence she was completely unaware of. She often saw her examining them carefully, muttering words under her breath, as if performing some sort of ritual. Despite Agatha's strange behavior in private, she continued to work for our family for several years. During this time, she became a constant presence in our lives and, in a way, became essential to the functioning of the home. Although we never delved into the details of her collection of mysterious objects, her work as a housekeeper was efficient and reliable. However, as often happens, difficult times came to our family. My father lost his job, and we found ourselves mired in monetary problems. It was at that moment that my parents made the difficult decision to send Agatha away. Even though she seemed to understand the situation, I could see a little annoyance in her eyes. After Agatha was sent away, the house was emptied of her presence. However, one day, while my parents were away, I heard a knock at the front door. When I opened it, I found Agatha standing before me with a calm but somewhat mysterious expression. She explained that she had come home because she had left some things in her old room and wanted them back. Even though I was surprised by her unexpected visit, I decided to let her in because I remembered her as an important part of our lives for so many years, and even though my parents had always told not to let strangers into the house, it wasn't a stranger. While Agatha searched her old room for her belongings, we struck up a brief conversation. She seemed fine, and she didn't mention anything about her life after she left. However, something in his eyes made me feel that there was something more behind his visit. Before saying goodbye, Agatha took something out of her bag and handed me an old-looking doll. It was a doll, handmade and delicate in appearance. She was a doll with chubby cheeks, soft hair, and strange, round, transparent green eyes that never closed. I appreciated his gesture, even if I was surprised by his gift. The doll was beautiful, but had a strange and mysterious aura.
His glass eyes seemed to follow me, and a cold feeling ran down my spine.
Although I felt a little uncomfortable, I accepted the gift and promised to take care of it. After handing over the doll, Agatha said goodbye to it and left the house without saying a word. My parents noticed how strange Agatha's doll gift was. Even though it bothered them, they decided not to intervene because they saw me happy with him. The doll became my favorite toy, and I spent hours playing and taking care of it. Even if sometimes his realism scared me a little, there was still something about him that made me love him a lot. Even if I never gave him a name, I just called him Baby. I played with him all day and we were almost never apart. However, everything changed on my 11th birthday. We had a house party, and several kids my age attended. While we were playing, some of them noticed that I still had the doll and started making fun of me. They laughed and called me a child because I was still playing with dolls at my age. I felt a mixture of shame and sadness and decided I didn't want the doll to be visible anymore. I approached my mother and told her I didn't want him anymore. She, noticing my distress, consoled me and understood my decision. We kept the doll in a box and took it to the basement where it would be hidden from others' eyes. As the days went by, the doll's presence in the basement seemed to weigh on me. Sometimes I would hear strange noises coming from that part of the house, and an uneasy feeling would come over me as I passed by the basement door. However, I kept telling myself that I had made the right decision. Little by little, the doll was forgotten in the cellar, covered in layers of dust and time. The years passed, and I grew up, leaving childhood behind and entering adolescence. One day, my mother came to pick me up from school, as always. But this time, she had a serious expression on her face. She told me that someone came into the house and destroyed my computer that I was chatting on. I was very sad and wondered who was to blame. Anxiety overwhelmed my mother when she came to pick me up from school that day. Her face showed worry and fear, and she quickly told me what had happened at home. Someone had broken in while we were gone and caused damage. My computer, among other things, was completely destroyed. Police found no signs of a break-in, leaving them perplexed with no leads to follow. We felt vulnerable and scared, not understanding how someone had managed to get in without leaving a trace. Uncertainty and fear have taken hold in our daily lives. That night, while I was in my room, still with the bitter taste of what had happened, I noticed something unusual. As I crouched next to my bed, I discovered a small cloth shoe hidden underneath. I immediately recognized this little shoe as part of the doll outfit I had kept in the basement years ago. Even though everything seemed strange to me, I decided not to dwell on it because I thought that maybe it could be something else. Not to mention that I had more important things to think about and worry about. Since these events affected me a little, to distract myself, my mother allowed me to invite my friend Lucy to sleep at her house. It was the night my parents were celebrating his birthday, and they went out to dinner. After snacking, Lucy and I went up to my room to play memory games. We were very amused when suddenly we heard a noise coming from the basement. It sounded like boxes were falling, and then we heard the basement door open and close. Perhaps one of the basement windows had been left open, and the wind had caused the commotion, we thought. We finished playing and went to bed, not giving it much importance. Suddenly we heard a groan coming from the stairs, as if someone was coming up. My heart raced, and a shiver ran down my spine. At that moment, I felt someone squeeze my arm very tightly. With the light from the hallway, I could make out the silhouette of Baby standing on the threshold of my room. Moved by fear, I turned on the lamp on my nightstand. As I bent down, I felt the blood freeze in my veins. I saw something move under the covers. Baby was dirty, and his clothes were ripped and torn. His shirt was in tatters, and his pants had a big hole. Under one of its legs, there were signs of having been eaten by mice. Her face was no longer pink, yellowish. He was missing an eye, and one of his boots was destroyed. He couldn't believe what he saw. Baby, he looked at me with his one eye, and a dirty tear rolled down his cheek. Then suddenly he jumped on the bed, on top of Lucy. At that moment, I realized that he was the one who destroyed my computer. Jealous, that I no longer paid attention to him or played with him. He was now going to attack my friend. Even though it was just a doll, it possessed enormous strength, because for a moment, he truly believed that he would get rid of both of them. We cling to him and push him with all our strength, managing to throw the doll at us. He disappeared into the darkness of the room, slipping into the shadows. Shortly after, my parents came home. I told them what happened, but they didn't believe my story. They thought it was just a figment of my imagination or an exaggerated nightmare. However, they went up to the attic to make sure the baby was there, but they found no trace of the doll. Days passed, and I heard no more about the doll. It seemed like everything was back to normal, although the feeling of fear and distrust was still lingering in my mind. Every little noise or shadow reminded me of that terrifying encounter with the doll. Sometimes I would wake up suddenly in the middle of the night, convinced I had heard whispers or footsteps near my bed. Even though I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, the fear persisted. One night, while I was sleeping peacefully, I was awakened by the incessant barking of my dog. The sounds became louder and more painful. At the same time, I heard a baby crying. My heart raced, and I jumped following the sound. As I entered the hallway, I realized the screaming was coming from the basement. Fear gripped me, but my curiosity pushed me to investigate. I walked down the trembling stairs and opened the basement door. What I saw made my blood run cold. Baby was there, crying uncontrollably. His appearance was even more deteriorated than before. He looked lost and desperate. I approached cautiously and reached out to touch him, but at the last moment, I stopped. Something in his eyes warned me not to get too close to me. I closed the basement door and returned to my room, shaking with fear and confusion. The next day, we looked all over the house for my dog, but found no trace of him. He had simply disappeared without a trace. From that day on, I started seeing his silhouette in every corner of my house. A quick glance down the hallway, and there he was, peeking around the corner. In the living room, his expressionless eyes seemed to watch me from an empty chair. Even in the middle of the night, I could make out his silhouette in the shadows of my room. Porcelain doll horror story. Most disturbing was that, even though no one else was home, some neighbors told me that someone was waving at them from the window above. They couldn't see clearly who he was, but they said he appeared to be a very small child. Every time I heard these stories, I felt a shiver run down my spine. My parents tried to calm me down by telling me that it was all a figment of my imagination and that this doll no longer existed. However, I knew the truth. He continued to stalk me from the shadows, stalking my home and those who dared to come near. The following days, the appearances of Baby became more frequent and worrying. Every time I saw him, I felt his presence invade me, generating an atmosphere of terror in the house. His glassy eyes followed me everywhere, and his childish laughter rang in my ears, even when I knew no one else was there. I tried to tell my parents about the apparitions, but their skepticism was still evident. They thought my imagination was playing tricks on me, or that the stress of recent events was affecting my mental health. They didn't want to admit that anything supernatural or malicious could happen to us. Meanwhile, the strange phenomena intensified. Objects have disappeared and appeared in unexpected places. The childish whispers and laughter became more audible, and I could sometimes feel a cold, hostile presence near me. My nights were filled with nightmares and sudden awakenings, not knowing if it was a product of my mind or if baby was behind everything. The nights were the worst. Often, I would wake up feeling like I was being watched, only to find baby's haunting eyes fixed on me. Her presence was suffocating, as if she was waiting for the right moment to take revenge on him. Over time, the shadow of baby began to affect my mental health. My nights were filled with horrible nightmares, and my mind was clouded with dark, paranoid thoughts. I felt trapped in an endless cycle of terror and anxiety. After so much time of terror and anguish, one day I came home from school to find an empty house. There was no sign of my parents or other family members. A feeling of loneliness came over me as I walked through the silent corridors. As I headed to my room, I began to hear an unmistakable sound, the cries of a baby. The sobs were weak and pitiful, but they filled the air with a feeling of desolation and sadness. The sound came from underground, from this dark and scary place that held so many secrets. Despite the fear that overwhelmed me, I felt the need to investigate. I carefully descended the stairs, following the sound that guided me to the source of the screams. Each step was an eerie echo in the silence of the house. When I reached the basement, the door was slightly ajar. A faint light filtered from within, illuminating the path into the unknown. I gathered the courage I needed and slowly pushed the door open, revealing the scene before me. There, in a dark corner of the basement, there was a little ball writhing on the floor, crying. For a moment, fear overwhelmed me, but this scream was different. It did not generate in me the same terror as the scream that had provoked me. Tormented for so long, he looked pitiful, almost like he was asking for help. I had no doubt that this was a real baby. I approached cautiously, unable to take my eyes off this baby who seemed to need help. I took the child in my arms and hugged him tenderly, trying to calm his sobs. My arms wrapped tenderly around the unknown baby, but as the moments passed, I began to feel its weight becoming more and more overwhelming. The pressure increased, as if an invisible force wanted to drag him down. An unsettling feeling came over me, and my eyes met those of the baby. Most worrying was the change in his physical appearance. His skin was worn and withered, revealing visible veins and bones beneath. His once perfect teeth were loosening and falling out one by one, leaving dark holes in his mouth. Despite this, his smile was still wide and grotesque, showing a mouth full of bleeding gums. As if this scene wasn't shocking enough, at one point he looked like he was going to make some gestures. But when he tried to speak, he only managed to emit a mixture of crying and guttural screams. His attempts to communicate became more and more desperate and heartbreaking, filling the air with terrifying sound. Fear took hold of me, and almost instinctively, I released the baby from my arms. I recoiled in horror at the disturbing sight that had revealed itself before me. The baby was now writhing on the floor, emitting a macabre laugh that echoed through the basement. I ran towards the stairs, desperate to get away from this abomination. Every step I took felt like a fight against an invisible force that wanted to keep me trapped. Finally, I exited the basement and closed the door behind me, trying to hide the horrors I had witnessed. My parents, who were arriving home at that time, alarmed by my screams and the noise coming from the basement, quickly came to meet me. I told them what had happened, but they understood that there was no point in looking for the baby again. They knew something sinister was lurking in our home and that we needed to protect ourselves. We decided to leave this house, leaving behind the terrors that had tormented us for so long. We moved to another place, far from the evil presence of Baby and his disturbing apparitions. The most disturbing thing was that, despite the move, whenever there was no one else at home, some neighbors told me that they sometimes heard baby cries coming from our house. They were agonizing, heartbreaking cries, as if a child was in pain. They even called the police several times, but when they arrived, the crying stopped and they found no trace of the baby in the house. I learned to live with this strange presence that seemed to follow me everywhere. I tried to ignore the baby's cries and baby sightings, but the feeling of unease and fear never completely went away. Years passed, and when I finally had a partner and wanted to start a family, I couldn't get pregnant. Despite medical reports indicating that there was no physical reason for my infertility, I knew deep down that it had something to do with Agatha and the porcelain doll. Over time, I came to accept that this was my reality. Agatha was part of my life, a constant presence that could not be ignored. I decided that if I couldn't get rid of her, then I had to learn to live in harmony with her disruptive influence. Thank you for joining us for this story that will give you chills. We hope you found it both exciting and challenging. If you enjoyed this video, consider participating in our channel by subscribing, liking it, and sharing it with your friends. Your support goes a long way in helping us create more engaging content for you. Goodbye, and may you always tread carefully into the world of the unknown.